Elara Sinclair's lungs burned raw. Her bare feet slapped against the rain-soaked pavement of Portland, every step sending a sharp bolt of pain from her heels to her knees. Rain lashed her face. Blood from the split in her lip mixed with the rainwater and ran down her chin. She ran. She ran on everything that was left inside a body that hadn't eaten in 2 days. Behind her, Troy Hadden's roar tore through the dark alley. "You think you can run from me?" 2 other shadows ran with him. His men, the kind she had seen far too many times before, at the entrance of the abandoned building where she hid, on the street corner where she begged for work. Everywhere she tried to disappear, Troy always found her. Always. Elara turned into a narrow alley. Brick walls rose high on both sides. Her foot slipped on the wet ground, and her knee smashed into the concrete. Pain. She pushed herself up and kept running. Then she stopped cold. Dead end. A brick wall in front of her. Brick walls on both sides. No windows. No fire escape. No way out. Behind her, the footsteps of Troy and his men echoed closer. 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 Elara's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her eyes swept across the alley one last time, desperate, panicked. Then she saw it. Parked tight against the wall, nearly swallowed by the darkness, was a sleek black SUV, the kind of vehicle she'd never had enough money to lay a hand on. And the trunk was cracked open by a few inches. Just a few. As if someone had shut it carelessly, and the latch hadn't caught. Elara didn't think, didn't weigh her options, didn't ask who the car belonged to. She just ran. Her hands grabbed the edge of the trunk, yanked it open, and she climbed inside, pulling the lid down after her. Darkness swallowed her whole. The scent of expensive leather, the scent of cedarwood, the scent of something entirely removed from the life she knew. She curled herself tight, both hands clamped over her mouth so her breathing wouldn't escape. She listened. Troy's footsteps ran past. His curses echoed back, then faded, then disappeared. Silence. Only the rain tapping against the trunk lid and the pounding of her heart as if it meant to break out of her chest. She was safe. She'd made it. All she had to do was lie still for a few more minutes, wait until Troy was truly gone, then climb out and disappear into the rainy Portland night the way she had 100 times before. That was the plan, but then the trunk gave a slight shudder. A front door opened, closed. A deep voice came through the back seat in Italian, fast and sharp. Then a second voice, older, respectful. "Yes, boss." The engine started, and the SUV carrying Elara Sinclair rolled out of the alley, out of the neighborhood, heading toward the hills. Elara held her breath. Panic rose into her throat. She needed to get out, needed to open the trunk and throw herself onto the road, but the car was moving too fast, and the voices in front began speaking about things Elara wished she hadn't heard. Names, money, a shipment at the port of Portland, this Saturday. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough. Enough to know she had just fled one devil, only to crawl into the trunk of another, and this devil was 10,000 times more dangerous than Troy Hadden. The car drove for 40 minutes. 40 minutes with Elara curled in the dark, not daring to move, not daring to breathe too hard. Then the car stopped. A garage door shut behind them. Footsteps came around to the back of the vehicle, and the trunk sprang open. Bright white light stabbed into her eyes. Elara threw up a hand to shield herself and squinted. The silhouette of an older man stood over her, one hand resting on the gun strapped at his waist. His eyes were cold, alert, but he wasn't the one who made Elara stop breathing. Behind him, another man stepped forward, tall, very tall, shoulders so broad they blocked half the garage light with his shadow. Black suit, black shirt, no tie, black hair swept back, warm olive skin, and eyes, gray, almost black, cold as steel, looking down at her where she lay curled inside his trunk. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He tilted his head to one side, slowly, as if he were studying a stray cat that had wandered into his territory. Then he spoke, his voice low, calm in a way that was almost frightening. "Dario, since when do we accept guests through the trunk?" The older man, Dario, answered crisply. "She was in there from the point of departure, boss." "At least 40 minutes. Silence." His piercing gaze stayed fixed on Elara's face. She could see him calculating, fast, cold, exact. She had been inside the car for the entire conversation. She had heard everything, and looking into those eyes, She knew that people who heard his secrets usually didn't live to tell them. He bent down. Closer. Elara caught the scent of expensive cologne and tobacco. He spoke slowly, one word at a time. Do you know what you just heard? Elara swallowed, the survival instinct honed by years on the street, 2 years in prison, 27 years of life kicking her in the face. That instinct told her to lie. Lie right now, lie as if her life depended on it. Because it did. She looked straight into those gray eyes. Her voice was hoarse, shaking, but it didn't break. I didn't hear anything. I was lying in the trunk so terrified I couldn't hear anything except my own heart pounding. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Those gray eyes didn't blink. Then he smiled. Not a warm smile. The smile of a man who had just found something interesting in the middle of a dull night. A smile that frightened Elara more than the moment Troy had grabbed her by the hair and dragged her across the floor. You lie pretty well, he said, straightening up, but not well enough. He turned to Dario, his tone as calm as if he were discussing the weather. Bring her inside. She's not going anywhere. Not until I decide. Dario nodded. His hand stayed on the gun. Elara lay in the trunk, staring up at the face of the man, deciding whether she lived or died, and realized one cruel truth. She had escaped Troy Hadden, the most brutal debt collector in Portland, only to fall straight into the hands of Nico Ferraro, the most dangerous mafia boss on the west coast of America. And the most terrifying part wasn't that he could kill her, it was that he hadn't. If you want to know why Nico kept her alive instead of making her disappear, hit like right now. Share this story with someone who needs to believe that sometimes darkness is where light begins. And subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will make it impossible for you to walk away. Dario led Elara down a long hallway, his hand still resting on his gun, his eyes never leaving her for even half a second. They stopped in front of a heavy wooden door at the end of the second floor. He opened it and gave a small nod for her to go inside. The room was more beautiful than any place Elara had ever slept in her life. A white bed, thick curtains, a dark wooden wardrobe, a private bathroom visible through a half-open door. But when Dario closed the door behind her, Elara heard the sharp click of the lock from the outside. The room was beautiful, but it couldn't be locked from within. She stood in the middle of the room and looked around, searching for a window. There was one large window facing the back garden, but it was the second floor, and there was no ledge, no drain pipe to climb. She tried the doorknob. Solid. It wouldn't budge. Elara sat down on the edge of the bed, wrapped her arms around her knees, and for the first time since climbing into the trunk, she let herself shake. Really shake. Not from the cold, but from the full realization of what had happened to her. She was locked inside the house of a mafia boss, a man whose secrets she had heard well enough to be killed for. And the door was locked from the outside, and not one person in this world knew she was here. She couldn't sleep. She lay on the softest bed she had ever known with her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling until the gray light of a Portland dawn slipped through the curtains. Then came the sound of the lock clicking. The door opened. Nico Ferraro walked in as though this were a meeting room and not a cell. He carried 2 cups of coffee, set one on the table beside the bed, then pulled out a chair and sat facing her. No hurry, no threats. Just the calm of a man who knew he held all the power in this room. He took a sip of coffee, then spoke, his voice low and slow, as though he were asking about the weather. Tell me, from the beginning, who are you? Why were you running? And why did you climb into my trunk? Elara looked at the cup of coffee on the table. Her stomach was burning with hunger, 2 days without food, and the smell of coffee made her head swim. She reached for the cup, took a sip, then began to speak. She told the truth because she had nothing left to lose. My name is Elara Sinclair. I'm 27, an orphan. I grew up in foster care in Oregon with my younger sister, Bryn. Bryn is 3 years younger than I am. She's the only person I've ever had in this world. Nico didn't interrupt, didn't nod, didn't react. He only listened. 5 years ago, Bryn got pregnant. No money, no insurance, no one to help. She got tangled up with Troy Hadden, borrowed money from him, and then couldn't pay it back. Troy forced Bryn to keep drugs in the house. The police came. Bryn was 7 months pregnant. Elara stopped there and swallowed. The next part was the part she hated most. I took the blame for her, told the police it was all mine, because if Bryn went to prison while she was pregnant, the baby would be taken into the system. I grew up in that system. I know what it's like. I wasn't going to let my niece or nephew go through that. For the first time, Elara saw something shift in Nico's gray eyes. Not pity, something closer to recognition, as if he were re-evaluating her from the beginning. 2 years in prison, Elara went on, her voice flat and quiet. When I got out, I looked for Bryn. Her phone number was disconnected. Someone else was living at her old address. No one knew where she had gone. She erased me from her life as if I had never existed. And Troy? Nico asked, his voice light but sharp. Bryn owed him money. When Bryn disappeared, he transferred the debt to me, said I had to pay for her. I had nothing, but he didn't care. He followed me everywhere, beat me, threatened me, chased me from one shelter to another until last night, when I climbed into your trunk. Silence. Nico drank his coffee. His eyes turned toward the window, but Elara knew he was processing every detail. Not the way a man listens with sympathy. The way a man fits pieces into their proper places in a much larger picture. He stood up. He didn't say thank you. Didn't say I'm sorry. Didn't say any of the things an ordinary man might say after hearing a story like that. He only said, "Stay here," then walked out. 2 hours later, Nico's phone rang. Kira Volkov, her voice cold and clipped as always. She's telling the truth. Elara Sinclair, 27. Orphan. Prior conviction for drug possession. 2 years at Coffee Creek Women's Prison. Released 5 months ago. No assets, no fixed address. Clean. And Troy Hadden? That's the interesting part, boss. Troy Hadden isn't just some low-level loan shark. He works for Cesare Mancini. Low rank, but inside Cesare's network. Runs errands, collects debts, sometimes handles transport. Nico fell silent. Cesare Mancini. Uncle Cesare. The longest-serving advisor in the Ferraro family. The man Nico's father trusted completely. The man Nico had quietly suspected for years without ever having proof. And now a homeless girl hiding in the trunk of his car was being hunted by one of Cesare's men. Coincidence or not, Nico Ferraro didn't believe in coincidence. He ended the call and stood by the office window looking down at the garden, thinking. Then he went back to Elara's room. This time he didn't bring coffee. Only a choice. You have 2 options, he said, standing in the doorway without stepping inside. 1. I open the gate, you walk out, and you go back to the streets of Portland. Troy Hadden will find you. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but he will find you. And this time he won't just beat you. Elara said nothing. 2. You stay here, not as a guest, not as a prisoner. You stay because I haven't decided yet what you are to me. While that remains true, you don't leave the house, you don't contact anyone outside, and you don't ask questions about my business. In exchange, Troy Hadden won't be able to touch you. He paused. And you'll be fed. That last sentence, spoken so mildly it almost sounded ordinary, was the one that made Elara's eyes sting, because he didn't say it like a favor. He said it like a fact, plain and ruthless, that he knew she was hungry, that he knew hunger could break a person faster than fear ever could. Elara looked at him, looked at those slate-colored depths, cold as steel, looked at that expressionless face, those broad shoulders filling nearly the whole doorway, that hand resting loose at his side yet ready for anything. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone. But between a mafia boss keeping her in a beautiful room and a debt collector who would kill her in a dark street, Elara Sinclair chose the lesser evil. I'll stay, she said. Nico nodded and turned away, and Elara remained sitting on the bed, inside a room that couldn't be locked from the inside, wondering whether she had just made the smartest decision of her life or the most foolish one. On the 3rd day, Elara was allowed out of the room. No one made any formal announcement. It was simply that when she woke that morning, the door was no longer locked from the outside. She pushed it open, stepped cautiously into the hallway, and waited for a barked order or for Dario to appear with his hand on his gun. Nothing came. There was only the long, silent corridor, the scent of old oak, and the gray Portland light filtering through the glass at the far end. She moved slowly, softly, with the instinct of someone who had spent too much of her life in spaces that didn't belong to her. Past the sitting room, past the kitchen, where Dario was making coffee with one hand and gave her a nod without saying a word, past the empty dining room, up the eastern staircase she had never taken before, and at the end of the 2nd-floor hall, through a door left slightly ajar, she heard a woman's voice speaking. Sharp, clear, commanding. He's looked at me with that face for 20 years, You think I don't know what he's thinking? If you think I'm crazy, then say it to my face. Don't stand there pretending you're innocent." Elara stopped and listened. There was no second voice answering back. She pushed the door a little wider and looked in. It was a large room, filled with books, washed in light from windows facing the garden, and in the middle of it stood a woman of about 62, pointing at a small porcelain angel on the shelf and scolding it in a stream of Italian and English, as though the statue had personally insulted her entire bloodline. Renata Ferraro. Elara had heard Dario mention her name only once, when he carried a tray upstairs and muttered that she still refused to eat breakfast. Renata turned, saw Elara in the doorway, and her dark eyes swept from head to toe over the girl as quickly and cleanly as a knife. "Who are you? The new maid? Cesare's spy? Or some foolish girl my son brought home because he's never known how to tell the difference between kindness and stupidity?" Elara didn't step back. She had faced prison guards. She had faced Troy Hadden. She had faced Nico Ferraro from inside the trunk of his car. An old woman yelling at porcelain angels didn't make the list of things that frightened her. "Maybe all three," Elara answered. Renata went silent for a beat. Then she laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one, startled out of her. The kind that comes when a person stumbles across something unexpected and finds they actually like it. "Come in and sit down," Renata said. Her voice was still sharp, but her eyes had softened just a little. "I'm dying of boredom with the people in this house. They all say yes, ma'am, like parrots." Elara sat in the armchair opposite Renata, and over the next 2 hours, she understood exactly why everyone assigned to care for Renata eventually ran away. Renata Ferraro wasn't a gentle mother figure. She was the widow of the late Mafia boss Salvatore Ferraro, a woman who had spent 40 years in a world where one wrong sentence could cost a life. She didn't teach Elara how to cook or tend a garden. She taught her how to read people. "When someone speaks to you, don't watch the eyes," Renata said, turning her teacup in her hands. "Eyes are the easiest thing to control. People practice looking straight at you while lying from the time they're children. Watch the hands. Hands don't know how to lie. A clenched hand means they're hiding something. A hand twisting a ring means they're worried. And a hand lying completely loose while they say something important means either they're telling the truth or they're more dangerous than anyone you've ever met." She paused, then fixed Elara with those razor-sharp eyes. "My son belongs to the second kind." Then she spoke of Matthias. Not from the beginning. Not in order. She spoke as though the story were an old wound she had carried so long, she no longer needed to explain the context around it. Matthias was 17. Smarter than his brother, but softer. He wasn't born for this world, but Nico kept believing he'd toughen up if he were taught. Then one day he disappeared. 8 years ago. No trace. No body. No explanation that was ever enough. Renata's eyes darkened. The police said he was dead. Nico said he'd find out what happened. No one found anything. But I know, Elara. A mother always knows. My son is alive somewhere. Elara didn't say I understand. She didn't say I'm sorry. She only gave a small nod, and the two of them sat in silence for a while. Then that afternoon, everything changed. Renata had been sitting with a book when suddenly she stopped. Her eyes changed. They looked through Elara as though she weren't there at all, as though Renata were staring at another place, another time. She began to speak, her voice small and broken, drifting in and out of Italian. Cesare called that night. I heard him from the next room. He was speaking Italian. Il ragazzo, that's what he said. The boy. Then he said an address, but I couldn't hear it clearly. The next morning Matthias left and never came home. Renata repeated the words over and over, her eyes gone distant, her hand trembling against the page. Elara didn't shake her, didn't call her name, didn't tell her to wake up. She sat still and listened, and when Renata slowly came back to herself, looking exhausted and ashamed, Elara said softly, "Keep going. If you remember anything else, tell me. I'll listen." That was the first day. In the days that followed, every time Renata drifted back into the past, Elara sat beside her and wrote everything down. In the small notebook she asked Dario for, she recorded every word. Cesare called late at night. Cesare said il ragazzo. Cesare said an address. Matthias left the next morning. Salvatore trusted Cesare, but I saw Cesare's eyes when Nico took the boss's chair. Those weren't the eyes of a loyal man. Those were the eyes of a man waiting. Each fragment on its own sounded like the rambling of an old woman losing her mind. But when Elara set them side by side, when she matched the dates, matched the names, matched the details, a picture began to emerge. Clear, consistent, terrifying. Renata Ferraro wasn't crazy. She had witnessed something 8 years earlier. She had tried to tell them, and for 8 years, not one person in that house had cared enough to believe her. Elara knocked on the door of Nico's study on the evening of the 12th day. She had waited that long because she needed certainty, needed enough fragments, needed to cross-check them enough times, needed to know that what she held in her hands wasn't delirium but evidence. Nico opened the door and looked at her with the expression of a man unaccustomed to being disturbed at that hour. She held the small notebook Dario had given her the week before, now filled to the edges with writing. "I need you to look at this," Elara said. Nico didn't ask why. He stepped aside and let her in. Nico's study looked nothing like the rest of the house. There were no paintings, no ornaments, only a heavy wooden desk, computer screens, stacks of files, and a bottle of liquor half gone. This was where he truly lived. Not in the mansion outside, but in this room, with its yellow desk lamp and the smell of old paper. Elara set the notebook on the desk, opened it, and spread the pages in front of him. She had arranged everything in order of time, 1 page for each day, 1 line for each thing Renata had said while drifting into the past. Beside every line, Elara had written her notes and cross-references. On the day Renata said Cesare had called late at night, Elara marked beside it, "Matches the night before Mattias disappeared," according to the record she had heard Nico mention during a call with Kira. On the day Renata murmured Il ragazzo, Elara wrote, "Italian means the boy. Mattias was 17 when he vanished." On the day Renata spoke of the look in Cesare's eyes when Nico sat in the boss's chair, Elara wrote beside it, "Your mother saw hatred no one else recognized." Nico read, slowly, page by page. At first his hand lay loose on the desk, then it gradually clenched. His knuckles turned white, his jaw hardened, his eyes never left the notebook, but Elara could see the storm building behind that stormy stare. When he finished the last page, he said nothing. He stood, walked to the window, and turned his back to her. The silence stretched so long, Elara could hear the clock on the wall. Then Nico punched the wall. 1 single punch. Hard, clean, controlled. Not a loss of control, but too much control. All of it forced into one blow instead of spilling outward. The plaster cracked. Blood welled over his knuckles. He didn't look down. "My mother said these things?" His voice was low and rough, as if each word had to pass through broken glass to get out. "Every day," Elara answered, in every spell when she drifted into the past. Every time she talked about the night Mattias disappeared, the same detail came back. Cesare called late at night. Il ragazzo. The next morning Mattias left. This isn't delirium. Nico, delirium isn't that consistent. She's telling you what she witnessed. For 8 years. And no one listened? Nico's voice broke on the last word. "No one," Elara said, and she didn't soften the cruelty of that truth. "The doctors said she was delirious." The caregivers nodded and let it pass. She paused for a beat, then spoke very gently. "And you were in too much pain to hear your mother speak about Mattias." Nico turned back. His eyes were red, but there were no tears. Ferraro men didn't cry, or at least Nico Ferraro didn't cry in front of anyone. But the pain in his eyes was unmistakable, alive, and more ferocious than any anger Elara had ever seen. "Why did you listen?" he asked. And the question wasn't an interrogation. It was something more real than that, something close to a plea he would never admit to making. "Because I know what it feels like to tell the truth and have no one believe you," Elara answered. "I told the police the drugs weren't mine. I told the lawyer. I told the judge. No one listened. I went to prison for 2 years because no one cared enough to listen to an orphan girl who couldn't afford a good lawyer." She looked straight into Nico's eyes. "Your mother is telling the truth. Just because she has bad days doesn't mean everything she says is delirium. Someone only had to be patient enough to sit down and put the pieces together." Silence. Nico looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the cold, appraising look from that first night in the garage. Not the calculating look he wore when he decided to keep her alive. This look was different, as if he were seeing her for the first time. He turned back to the desk, picked up his phone, and dialed a number. "Kira, I need you to watch Cesar Mancini." Absolute secrecy. No one in the family can know. Every call, every meeting, every transaction. Report directly to me. He ended the call, looked at the notebook on the desk, then looked at Elara. You should get some rest, he said, his voice already calm again, controlled again, as if the punch in the wall and the blood on his hand had never happened. But when Elara stood and walked toward the door, she could feel his eyes on her back. She turned at the threshold. Nico was looking at her, and in those gray eyes, for the first time, there was no calculation, no caution, no distance, none of the cold reserve he kept between himself and everyone around him. There was only gratitude, rough, quiet, and so real he could barely say it aloud. Thank you, Elara, he said. That was all. 2 words. But it was the first time he had spoken her name. Not you. Not the girl in the trunk. Not the name on a file. Elara. She nodded, stepped out, and closed the door softly behind her. She walked the hallway back to her room, and wondered when exactly being called by name by a Mafia boss had begun to make her chest feel so warm. After that night, everything between Nico and Elara shifted. Not loudly, not with declarations, just with small changes they both noticed, and neither one spoke aloud. Elara's door was no longer locked from the outside. Nico gave no order. Dario simply stopped locking it. Elara was free to move through the house, to go down to the kitchen whenever she wanted, to sit with Renata for as long as she pleased. And each night, when the house sank into silence, Elara would go downstairs for water and find that Nico was already there. On the first night, he sat at the kitchen bar with a glass of liquor, reading through files. He looked up when she walked in, said nothing. She poured herself water, sat 2 stools away from him, and said nothing too. They sat in the darkness of the kitchen, with only the dim light above the stove glowing softly, and that silence wasn't heavy. It was only 2 people too tired to pretend, but not yet ready to trust enough to speak the whole truth. On the second night, Nico spoke first. Matthias liked to draw, he said suddenly, his eyes on the glass in his hand. Ever since he was little, he drew on everything, on the walls, on the floor, even on my father's important papers. Salvatore would lose his mind, but he never punished him because the drawings were actually beautiful. He paused. I was the one who pulled him into the family business. My father died. I took his place. And I needed someone beside me I could trust. Matthias was 17. He didn't want it, but he was my younger brother, and he didn't know how to say no to me. Nico's voice was flat and controlled, but Elara could hear the crack beneath it. He disappeared 6 months later, he said, and I know that no matter who was behind it, the first fault was still mine, because I dragged him into a place he never belonged. Elara was quiet for a while. Then she told him her own story. Bryn hated the orphanage. She cried every night for the first 3 years. I was the one who held her and told her everything would be all right, that I'd always protect her. And I kept that promise. When she got involved with Troy, when the police came, I didn't think for even a second. I took the blame. 2 years in prison, because I promised I'd protect my sister. She took a sip of water. When I got out, I called Bryn's number. Disconnected. I went to the old address. A stranger answered the door. I asked neighbors, mutual friends. No one knew, or no one wanted to say. Bryn erased me the way people erase old messages. Cleanly, completely. She looked at Nico. I gave up everything for her, and she didn't care enough to leave me even one explanation. The kitchen fell quiet. The 2 of them sat there with wounds that were strangely alike. Both of them had loved a younger sibling more than anyone else in the world. Both of them had lost that sibling. Both of them carried guilt and betrayal tangled together so tightly they didn't even know where healing could begin. Nico didn't say, I understand. He didn't say, I'm sorry. He only poured himself more liquor and pushed Elara's glass of water a little closer to her. That was enough. The nights that followed began to string themselves together, and the dark kitchen became the place where they were most real. Nico told her about the ex-wife who had left because she couldn't bear the darkness around him. Elara told him about the first nights after prison, sleeping under a bridge because the shelters were full. Nico told her how Dario had carried him when he was 10 years old, after he fell in the garden and broke his ankle, and how Salvatore had shouted at him for bothering Dario instead of getting up on his own. Elara told him about the first time Troy hit her, how she fell onto the sidewalk and not one person walking past stopped. They traded their broken pieces the way people trade puzzle fragments. not needing to complete the whole picture, only needing to know the other person was broken too. By day, Nico began teaching Elara how to defend herself. Not in a gym, but in the backyard, on the grass, beneath Portland's gray light. He taught her how to break free when someone grabbed her wrist, how to use her elbow when pinned too close, how to fall without getting hurt. Serious, patient, and never touching her longer than necessary. Until the fourth lesson, when Nico held her from behind and told her to get free. Elara stomped on his foot, drove her elbow into his ribs, and when he loosened his hold for one startled second, she turned and hooked his leg out from under him. Nico landed on the grass and stared up at the sky, blinking. "You fight dirty." "I don't live clean," she answered, standing over him. "That's survival, not dirty fighting." Across the yard, Dario was wiping down a car. He turned his face away, but his shoulders shook. He tried to hide it, but the laugh still slipped out. Elara began noticing the small changes in Dario too. He started leaving extra food for her at dinner, never saying a word, only setting the plate a little closer to where she sat. He opened the car door for her when Nico took her out to buy clothes, doing it with the same easy instinct he used for Nico. He called her by name, Elara, instead of that girl or nothing at all. Every detail was tiny, but Elara understood the language of people who didn't speak with words. Dario was telling her that she belonged here. Renata, on the other hand, wasn't subtle at all. She started calling Elara down to the kitchen at exactly the hour Nico happened to be there, asking both of them to help rearrange the bookshelves in the library, forgetting that she had invited Elara for tea at the exact time Nico ate dinner. When Elara finally caught on and gave her a knowing look, Renata winked. "I'm old, dear. I forget things." "This old woman doesn't forget anything," Elara replied. "Correct," Renata said calmly. "But don't tell Nico I said that." Then one night, later than usual, Elara was lying in her room reading when she heard a soft knock at the door. She opened it. Nico stood in the hallway, still dressed in the clothes he had worn all day. His eyes tired, his hair slightly fallen out of place, no longer swept back with the same control he carried in daylight. He didn't step inside. He only stood at the threshold, one hand resting against the frame, looking at her with those gray eyes Elara had learned to read through long nights in the kitchen. "Thank you," he said. "For my mother. She's been so much better since you came. For Matthias. For those notes. For the first time in 8 years, I have something besides blind hope." He paused. "For being here." Then he gave a small nod, turned, and walked away down the dark hallway without looking back. Elara closed the door, stood with her back against the wood, pressed her hand to her chest where her heart was beating faster than usual, and she thought, with a clarity so sharp it couldn't be denied, "I'm falling in love with a Mafia boss." And the most frightening part wasn't that he was dangerous, it was that she didn't want to stop. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows that morning. The rare kind of Portland sun that broke through in the middle of the rainy season, warm and golden, and so unexpected that Renata declared it a good omen and insisted on making pasta from scratch to celebrate. Elara stood by the kitchen counter with a knife in her hand, a pile of onions in front of her that Renata had ordered her to cut into neat, even cubes. She had managed 3 slices before Renata cried out, No, no, no. What in the world are you doing? This is an onion, not firewood. Look here." Renata snatched the knife, made one perfect slice with the precision of a woman who had been cooking for 40 years, then handed it back. Like that, thin and even. If Salvatore were still alive, he'd make you cut the whole thing again from the beginning. Was he really that particular about onions? Elara asked, trying to follow the method Renata had just shown her. He was particular about everything, Renata said, her voice carrying that mix of irritation and tenderness that only belongs to people who have loved someone for a very long time. But onions were the first thing he checked at every meal. He used to say you could tell whether a person had patience by the way they cut an onion. At the table, Nico sat with a cup of coffee, leaning back in his chair, one leg stretched out. He wore a black t-shirt, no suit, no gun in sight, his hair still damp from the shower and not yet pushed into its usual perfect place. He looked so ordinary that Elara had to remind herself the man drinking coffee across from her ran the largest criminal empire on the West Coast. He watched the 2 women cook, hiding a smile behind the rim of his cup, not a full smile. Nico Ferraro didn't quite smile in front of other people, but the corner of his mouth lifted, and his eyes softened in that way Elara had begun to recognize only happened when he was near his mother and her. Outside in the yard, Through the kitchen glass, Dario was polishing the black SUV with one hand, the other still wrapped from an old injury that hadn't fully healed. He was whistling an Italian tune Elara didn't know by name but had heard every morning since her second week in the house. Renata lit the stove, set a pot of water on it, and then began telling a story no one had asked for. "Do you know how Salvatore courted me?" she asked Elara, stirring the heating water. "He brought flowers to my door every day for 3 months. I never opened the door once." "Why not?" Elara asked. "Because I knew who he was," Renata said, her eyes drifting somewhere far away. "I knew what he did. I knew the world he belonged to. And I was smart enough to be afraid. But in the end, you opened the door anyway, because on the 91st day, it was pouring rain. I looked through the window and saw him standing there in the downpour, holding that bouquet, soaked like a stray cat. And he wasn't knocking. He was just standing there, waiting, like every other day." Renata smiled into the memory. "I opened the door and said, 'Are you insane? Come inside before you freeze to death.' He stepped in, handed me the flowers, and said, 'I'd stand out there 91 more days if I had to, but I'd rather come inside.'" She gave a soft laugh. "When Ferraro men fall in love, they don't know how to give up. That's their greatest strength and their greatest weakness." Then Renata looked over at Nico. Nico was looking at Elara. Not the way a man sneaks a glance. Not the way someone happens to look by accident. He was watching her cut onions with the kind of focus people usually reserve for things they treasure. The kind of look the person giving it doesn't realize is visible, but everyone else in the room can see it plain as day. Elara looked up and caught that look, and everything in the kitchen stopped for one beat. Just one. Then she looked away, her face growing warm, her hand tightening around the knife handle, her heart stumbling out of rhythm. She pretended to focus on the onions, as though onions were the most important thing in the world. Renata stood by the boiling water with her back to both of them, and smiled. A small, knowing smile. The smile of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize love before the people inside it could name it for themselves. She said nothing. Didn't push. Didn't tease. She only smiled at the pot and kept stirring. They ate breakfast together around the kitchen table. Not in the big dining room that hadn't been used once since Elara arrived, but in the kitchen, around the bar, the four of them together. Renata sat at the head, eating pasta and complaining that the onions were still cut too thick. Nico ate without complaint, glancing at Elara now and then when he thought she wasn't looking. Elara ate and listened as Renata kept talking about Salvatore, about the loud family dinners when Nico and Mattias were still boys, about Mattias secretly drawing on the tablecloth and Salvatore pretending to be furious, while quietly putting the cloth away to keep it. Dario carried his plate in from the yard, sat at the far end, and ate in silence, but his eyes were gentler than Elara had ever seen them. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows and laid a warm, golden wash across the table. Renata laughed at something Elara said about the onions. Nico shook his head, but the corner of his mouth lifted again. Dario whistled softly while washing the dishes, and Elara sat in the middle of it all, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, looking around that kitchen, looking at these people, and thinking with a clarity so sharp it hurt in her chest, maybe I belong here, for the first time in 27 years, belonging to a place, to people, in a house with morning laughter and the scent of pasta and yellow sunlight spilling through the glass. She didn't know it was the last morning everything would still be peaceful. That afternoon, 3 hours after breakfast with pasta and golden sunlight, Nico left the house with Kira. Before he went, he stopped at the kitchen doorway where Elara was washing dishes and said briefly, "I'm meeting a source. I'll be back late. Watch my mother." Then he walked away, and Elara didn't know that it was the last time she would see him inside a house that was still whole. In the car, Kira opened her laptop and laid out everything she had gathered during 2 weeks of watching Cesare Mancini. Cesare had met secretly with representatives of the Marchetti family twice in 14 days, at a restaurant on the outskirts of Portland, in a private room, with no one from the Ferraro family accompanying him. Cesare had moved money through 3 hidden accounts across 2 different banks, a total amount large enough to buy the loyalty of a small army. And most important of all, Cesare owned a secret property on the eastern edge of Portland, an old farm that no one in the Ferraro family knew existed, with armed guards posted there at all times, food deliveries arriving regularly, and encrypted communication signals going out every day. Kira hadn't yet confirmed what was inside, but she told Nico in her usual flat, precise voice. "People don't hire armed guards to watch an empty farm, boss." Nico listened, his jaw tight, his eyes on the road ahead. He knew he needed at least a week of careful surveillance before he could move in. He needed to know how many men were guarding the place, what the shift changes looked like, where the weak points were in the security system, how many ways in and out there were. Moving too fast was the quickest way to lose people. He had learned that lesson when he lost Matthias. But Nico didn't have a week, because what Nico didn't know was that Cesare already knew. 2 days earlier, one of Cesare's men planted inside the Ferraro house, a man Nico had not yet identified, had warned Cesare that Kira Volkov was watching him. Cesare understood at once. If Kira was watching, Nico had given the order. If Nico had given the order, then Nico either knew or was about to know. And Cesare Mancini had not survived 40 years by sitting still and waiting for his enemies to strike first. At 3 in the afternoon, while Nico and Kira were on the far side of the city, a black truck stopped outside the gates of the Ferraro estate. 6 men stepped out, black clothes, masks, handguns. Leading them was one man without a mask, Troy Hadden, walking with the confidence of someone who had been armed with precise intelligence from Cesare Mancini, including the house's layout, the exact locations of the cameras, and every hidden blind spot. Troy Hadden. Dario was outside in the yard polishing a car when he heard the gate being forced. The instinct built over 40 years of serving the Ferraro family reacted before he had time to think. He dropped the cloth, pulled the gun from his holster with his uninjured hand, and moved toward the gate. 2 gunmen rushed in first. Dario shot them both before they could even aim. The 3rd gunman ducked behind a gate pillar and fired 3 times. The first shot missed. The second missed. The third hit Dario in the right shoulder, the very arm holding the gun. He went down, his back slamming into the gravel. Blood soaked through the white shirt he wore every day like an unofficial uniform. But before he lost consciousness, Dario's left hand reached for the security panel mounted inside the gate pillar and hit the alarm button. The siren tore through the entire estate. In the library on the 2nd floor, Elara heard the gunfire before she heard the alarm. 3 shots in quick succession, dry and sharp, then 3 more, then the scream of the siren. She shot to her feet. Renata sat in the armchair, the book slipping from her hand, her eyes wide but not panicked. She had heard gunfire too many times in her life to panic now. "Lock the door," Renata said, her voice turning sharp again. No longer the old woman who had been telling love stories that morning, but the wife of Salvatore Ferraro, the woman who had survived 3 purges and 2 assassination attempts. "Lock the door and don't open it for anyone." Elara ran to the door. She hadn't even touched the handle when it burst open from the outside. Hard enough to make her stumble back, and Troy Hadden stepped in. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she had forgotten, because the mind has a way of erasing details about the things that frighten it most. He wore a black coat, a gun at his waist, and on his right hand there was blood. Dario's blood. Elara looked at that hand and her stomach turned. Behind Troy, 2 other gunmen stood in the hallway, blocking every path out. Troy looked at her, then at Renata in the chair, then back at Elara, and he smiled. That smile Elara had seen 100 times before, the smile he wore before he hit her, before he yanked her by the hair, before he reminded her that she was nothing but a debt unpaid. "Remember me?" he said. Troy grabbed Elara by the hair before she could step back. The hand still stained, with Dario's blood twisted into her auburn hair and yanked hard, dragging her out of Renata's room and into the hallway. Elara fell, her knees slamming against the wooden floor, and Troy kept pulling, dragging her across the boards like a sack, the way he had done dozens of times before in the alleys of Portland. "You've been hiding here for weeks and thought I wouldn't find you?" Troy said, his voice light, almost casual, as if they were having an ordinary conversation. "Uncle Cesare knows everything, sweetheart. Knows you're here, knows which room you sleep in, knows what you eat for breakfast." He stopped in the middle of the hallway, let go of her hair, then drove his boot into her ribs. Elara folded in on herself, the breath ripped from her lungs. Pain. Familiar pain. He kicked her again. The old bruises from before had never fully healed, and now new ones bloomed over them, pain on top of pain. But Elara Sinclair wasn't the girl she had been 5 months ago. 5 months ago, she would have curled inward, covered her head, waited for Troy to stop, begged in silence. 5 months ago, She had known nothing except endurance. Now, lying on the polished floor of the Ferraro house, Elara heard Renata's voice in her head. Stay calm. Observe. Wait for the moment. Don't react with emotion. And Nico's voice too, low and steady, from those afternoons in the yard. When you're being hit, don't try to block. Absorb it. Wait. The one throwing the punches always leaves an opening after the hardest blow because they think you're finished. That's when you fight back. And then the lesson from 2 years at Coffee Creek. The simplest and cruelest lesson of all. Pain is only a signal, not a command. The body says it hurts, but it doesn't order you to fall. So Elara didn't fall. She lay on the floor, absorbed the pain, and waited. Troy turned his back on her. He barked at the 2 gunmen behind him. Get in the room, tie up the old woman, bring her downstairs. Careful, Cesare needs her alive. The moment Troy turned away, Elara moved. She didn't try to take him down. She knew she wasn't strong enough. Troy was bigger, heavier, armed, but she caught his wrist and twisted, exactly the way Nico had taught her, hard enough to throw him off balance for half a second, sudden enough to make him spin back around with his eyes wide. She drove her elbow into his face, not into the bridge of his nose the way she'd wanted, but into his cheekbone, hard enough to stun him. He stumbled back a step, one hand flying to his face, then stared at her with an expression Elara had never seen on him before. Not anger. She knew anger. This was surprise. Troy Hadden wasn't used to being hit back by someone he considered weaker than himself. You dare, he began, but Elara cut him off, her voice clear, not shouting, not pleading, not shaking. You don't have any right over me anymore. You never did. Troy looked at her. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then he slapped her, hard. Elara's head snapped to the side, her ear ringing, the taste of blood filling her mouth, but she turned back and looked at him. Her gaze didn't drop, didn't bow, didn't flinch away. She looked straight into Troy Hadden's eyes with the stare of someone who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. And for the first time in the brutal history between them, Troy was the one who stepped back. Only half a step, barely noticeable. But Elara saw it, and Troy knew she had seen it. He ground his teeth, seized her wrist, and dragged her down the stairs. Behind them, the 2 gunmen were leading Renata out. She wasn't screaming, wasn't struggling. She moved with the dignity of a woman who had spent 40 years in this world, her back straight, her head high, her sharp eyes taking in each gunman's face, as if committing every one of them to memory. They were forced outside. The black truck sat by the gate, beside the bodies of the 2 gunmen Dario had taken down. Dario lay near the gate pillar. Blood pooled beneath his shoulder, his eyes closed, his chest still rising and falling. Alive. Elara looked at him and prayed with something she wasn't even sure was faith or desperation. Please live, old man. They shoved her and Renata into the back of the truck. Troy sat across from them, gun resting on his thigh, staring at Elara with a new kind of fury, the fury of a man who had just been humiliated by the person he despised most. He would make her pay for that elbow. Elara knew it. But not yet. For now, he needed her alive as a hostage. The truck pulled away. Renata sat beside Elara, her back still straight, her hand wrapped around Elara's. That hand was warm, dry, and strangely steady, not trembling at all. She leaned her head toward Elara and whispered, softly enough that Troy couldn't hear over the engine, "You did well." Elara looked at her. Renata's eyes were bright, clear, sharper than Elara had ever seen them. No confusion, no drifting. Completely here, in this moment, with the calm of someone who had already walked through hell and knew the way back out. "Now stay calm," Renata whispered again. "Wait, Nico will come." Elara tightened her grip on Renata's hand, and believed her. Nico saw Dario before the car had even fully stopped. He shoved the door open while the wheels were still rolling, his shoes hitting the gravel hard as he ran to the gate pillar where Dario lay on his side. White shirt soaked red from shoulder to hip, eyes closed, breathing shallow. 2 dead gunmen lay a few yards away, their blood mixing with Dario's on the gravel. Kira ran after him, dropped to her knees, and checked Dario's pulse. He's alive. Weak pulse. He needs an ambulance now. Nico didn't hear her, or he heard and didn't react. He straightened and looked at the broken gate, the smashed security cameras, the unfamiliar tire tracks cut into the driveway. Then he walked into the house. The living room was wrecked, a vase on the table shattered. the sofa shoved out of place. Dirty footprints tracked across the marble floor, Dario polished every morning. Nico went up the stairs, Renata's library, door standing open, the armchair empty. The book Renata had been reading face down on the floor, its spine broken. Elara's room, door open too. The bed unmade from that morning. The coffee cup on the bedside table gone cold. The jacket she wore most often, still hanging behind the door, her scent still lingering in the room. Nico stood in the middle of the downstairs hall, among the broken things, inside a silence heavier than any scream. He didn't shout, didn't punch a wall the way he had the night he read Elara's notebook, didn't smash anything, didn't curse. He only stood there, both hands hanging at his sides, hollowed gaze staring straight ahead without seeing anything at all, and said nothing. Kira stepped in behind him after calling an ambulance for Dario, looked at Nico, and stopped where she was. She had worked for Nico Ferraro for 4 years. She had seen him angry, seen him cold, seen him ruthless, in ways that would keep other people awake for the rest of their lives. But she had never seen him like this. Absolute silence. Empty eyes. Body still. As though every ounce of rage, every flicker of fear, every shard of pain had been compressed into one dense, lethal mass inside his chest, waiting to explode. "Boss," Kira said, carefully, as if she were trying to disarm a bomb. "We need calm. A plan. We need location confirmation. Recon before we—" "Cesare has my mother," Nico cut in. His voice was flat, not raised, not shaking. Flat as still water before a storm. The kind of flatness anyone who had lived long enough in this world knew was a sign of disaster. "He has Elara. He dies tonight." Kira said nothing more, because after 4 years, she knew this much. A calm Nico Ferraro was the most dangerous Nico Ferraro of all. When he yelled, he was still processing emotion. When he went quiet, he had already made up his mind. And nothing on earth changed Nico Ferraro's mind once he had gone quiet. Kira opened her laptop right there on the kitchen counter, that still held the faint smell of pasta from that morning. The same place where, only hours earlier, Renata had scolded Elara for chopping onions too thick, while Nico hid a smile behind his coffee cup. She pulled up everything from the surveillance on Cesare over the past 2 weeks. The farm outside eastern Portland. That's the only place with the infrastructure to hold hostages. Armed guards, perimeter fencing, basement access. If Cesare took them anywhere, it's there. Nico nodded. "Call everyone. Everyone still loyal. Make it clear. Cesare is a traitor. Anyone standing with him dies with him. I want them assembled in 2 hours." Kira made the calls. Over the next 2 hours, Nico turned the kitchen into a war room. Satellite images of the farm spread across the laptop screen. Routes in, routes out. Estimated guard numbers based on Kira's reports. 1 team for the assault, 1 to cut off escape, 1 in reserve. The fastest operation Nico had planned in his life. Because he didn't have time. Because every minute passing was another minute his mother and Elara remained in Cesare's hands. And Nico knew Cesare well enough to know the man was ruthless enough to do anything if he felt cornered. In the middle of all that, Nico's phone rang. Not Kira. Not one of his men. The hospital. Dario was in surgery. The bullet had gone through his right shoulder, shattered the scapula, and cost him a dangerous amount of blood. Critical but stable. Nico ended the call. No expression. But his hand clamped down on the kitchen counter so hard, his knuckles went white. 15 minutes before the convoy rolled out, Nico went to the hospital. Dario lay in bed, eyes open, face gray from blood loss, IV in his left arm. His right arm lay immobilized in bandages. He looked at Nico as he entered, and the first thing he said wasn't about his own wound. "They have Renata. They have Elara. I know. I couldn't hold them." Dario's voice broke. The first time Nico had ever heard him speak with such weight, and the first time was to apologize. "You held them," Nico said, his voice softer than it had been at any point that night. "You took down 2 men. You hit the alarm. You did enough." Dario reached for Nico's hand with his left, old hand, rough hand, trembling faintly from blood loss but still gripping hard. "Bring them home." Nico closed his hand around Dario's. "I will bring them home." Then he stood, walked out of the hospital room, and crossed the parking lot to where the black convoy waited. 12 men, 4 vehicles, fully armed. Kira sat in the lead car with her laptop open, headset on, ready. Nico got behind the wheel of the first vehicle himself. He wouldn't let anyone drive him tonight. Tonight, he drove. The convoy rolled into the wet Portland night. 40 minutes to Cesare's farm. 40 minutes. The same stretch of road Elara had once spent curled in the trunk of his SUV, terrified, alone, with no idea where she was being taken. Now Nico was the one counting every minute. And he swore, silently, beneath the rain hammering the windshield and the steady rhythm of the wipers, that in 40 minutes he would have them back, or Cesare would not live to see the dawn. Rain came down over Cesare's farm, as if the sky itself wanted to wash clean whatever was about to happen beneath it. The black convoy stopped 300 meters from the gate. Lights off, engines dead. In the darkness and the sound of rain, 12 men spread out into the exact positions Nico had assigned 2 hours earlier. Kira led a team of 4 around to the rear, where the farm fence was lowest and the cameras were fewest. Her job was to cut the power, take down the guards in back, and block any escape route. Kira gave Nico a sharp nod through the radio, her voice clipped and clean. Team 2 is in position. Nico stood in front of the lead vehicle, rain hammering his shoulders, soaking through his black shirt. He wasn't wearing body armor. Kira had placed a vest on the passenger seat before they left. He hadn't touched it. The 4 men in Nico's team looked at him standing in the rain. No armor, no helmet, nothing but the pistol at his waist, and that flint-like stare that in the darkness looked almost entirely black. No one asked why he wasn't wearing the vest. They knew. Nico Ferraro wasn't afraid of dying tonight, and a man who isn't afraid of death is more dangerous than any armor. 3, 2, 1. The lights at the farm went out. Kira cut the power on time. Darkness swallowed everything. Then Nico moved. He didn't sneak. He didn't hide. He walked straight through the main gate Kira's team had just opened remotely, stepped across the wet gravel, and when the first guard swung a flashlight toward the gate, Nico fired. 1 shot. Clean. The guard dropped. After that, chaos broke loose. Gunfire erupted from every direction. Nico's team hit from the front, Kira's from the back. Cesare's guards were more numerous than expected, 15 instead of 10. But they were caught off guard, cut apart, attacked in darkness and rain, and most of them weren't the kind of men ready to die for their employer. They were hired muscle. When they realized the attack was organized and the men coming for them had no intention of taking prisoners, half of them threw down their weapons within the first 10 minutes. Nico stormed through the front door of the farmhouse. Inside was pitch dark. He flicked on the light mounted beneath his gun, swept it across an abandoned sitting room, across the hallway, searching for stairs to the basement. 1 guard came out of a dark corner, and Nico dropped him with 2 shots before the man could raise his weapon. He didn't stop, didn't check the body. He kept moving. The concrete stairs led down, damp, dark. The smell of mildew mixed with something else Nico didn't want to identify. He went down 1 step at a time, gun raised in front of him, his heartbeat unnaturally steady because his body had shifted into the state he only reached in the most dangerous moments. The state where emotion locks away and combat instinct takes over completely. At the bottom of the stairs was a wooden door, locked from the outside. Nico shot the lock, kicked the door open, and saw her. Elara was sitting against the basement wall, her hands bound behind her back with plastic ties, her face bruised, her lips swollen, dried blood on her chin. But her eyes were open, awake, alive. She looked straight at him as he came through the doorway, and Elara Sinclair didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't collapse. She looked at him and said, her voice hoarse, "I knew you'd come." Nico dropped to 1 knee in front of her. His hand reached out to cut the bindings, and that was when Elara saw something she had never seen before. Nico Ferraro's hand was shaking, the hand that had held a gun and dropped 5 men in the last 15 minutes. The hand that stayed unnaturally steady even when bullets passed close enough to graze the air by his ear. That hand shook when it touched the plastic ties around Elara's wrists. He cut them away, gentle in a way completely at odds with everything he had done upstairs. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, controlled, but Elara heard the fracture beneath it. "Just beaten up," she answered, trying to keep her tone even. "I'm used to it." Nico's jaw hardened. His eyes darkened. The kind of darkness Elara had learned wasn't the darkness of calm, but the darkness of anger compressed so tightly it was close to exploding. Those 2 words, "used to it," hurt him more than any bullet could have, because they meant she had been beaten often enough to think of it as normal. and Nico hated the world for that. Then came hurried footsteps overhead, the sound of someone crashing down the stairs. Troy Hadden appeared in the basement doorway, face pale, eyes wild, gun in his hand but not aimed at anyone because he was running, not attacking. He saw Nico. Froze. Nico rose to his feet, slowly, set his gun on the floor, and walked toward Troy. Troy raised his weapon. His hand shook 10 times harder than Nico's had. Don't come any closer." Nico didn't stop. He stepped forward, knocked the barrel aside with his left hand, and drove his right fist straight into Troy's face. Troy went down. Nico hauled him back up and hit him again. A third time, a fourth. Controlled. Every punch, precise, brutal, deliberate, not a loss of control. This was disciplined violence, the kind Nico Ferraro had learned as a boy and perfected over 20 years. Troy ended up sprawled on the concrete floor, face swollen, nose bleeding, crying, "Please, please, have mercy. I was only following orders. Cesare made me do it." Nico didn't look at him. He turned to Elara and asked, his voice as calm as if he were asking whether she wanted coffee or tea. "What do you want me to do with him?" Elara looked at Troy, looked at the man who had hunted her across Portland, beaten her in dark alleys, dragged her by the hair across the floor of the Ferraro house, forced her to live for 5 months in constant fear. The man now lying on the ground, crying and begging, so weak and pathetic that Elara found herself wondering why she had ever been afraid of him at all. "Turn him over to the police," Elara said, her voice clear and steady, "along with all the drug trafficking evidence Kira has collected. Let him learn what it means to lose his freedom." Nico looked at her, then nodded. "As you wish." Nico left Troy for 2 of his men to tie up, then went upstairs. The farmhouse had gone silent. Kira's team controlled the rear. Nico's team controlled the front. The remaining guards had either been taken down or were kneeling in the hallway with their hands behind their heads. Nico passed them all without a glance. He moved toward the far end of the first-floor hall, where a closed door stood with light spilling beneath it. He opened it. Cesare Mancini was seated behind a desk, leaning back in his chair, both hands resting on the desktop, as calm as if he were waiting for dinner guests. No gun, no movement, no attempt to run. He looked at Nico stepping into the room, rain still soaking his black shirt, other people's blood on his hands, predatory gaze that in the yellow light looked like a wolf's. And Cesare said, his voice low, mild, almost affectionate, "You came faster than I expected." Nico stood in the doorway, didn't step closer. He didn't need to. The distance between them was 5 meters, but it was close enough for Nico to see every line in the face of the man his father had called brother, the man Nico had called uncle for 36 years, the man who had carried him when he was 3, taught him to shoot when he was 12, stood beside his father's coffin when he was 28, and sold out his little brother when Matthias was only 17. Cesare looked at Nico, and he didn't beg, didn't ask for mercy, didn't cry. He justified himself. 36 years, Cesare said, his tone flat and steady. 36 years I served this family, since your father was still running shipments in an old truck. I built this empire with Salvatore, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, contact by contact. I gave up everything, and when Salvatore died, the boss's chair, the chair I had earned with blood and sweat over 3 decades, he handed to a 28-year-old boy instead of me. Nico said nothing. "You think I betrayed you?" Cesare tilted his head. "I think I took back what was mine. Matthias was the most valuable asset I had. With him in my hands, I controlled the Marchetti family, controlled the eastern shipping route, and if you hadn't been so stubborn, I would have controlled you too." Silence. Nico looked at Cesare, looked at the man who had turned his brother into a hostage for 8 years and called him an asset, looked at the man who had sat down to Christmas dinner with Renata every year while knowing her son was locked in a basement 40 minutes away, looked at the snake that had lain in the heart of the family for 30 years and gone unnoticed. "You'll live," Nico said. His voice was so cold the air in the room seemed to harden around the words. "You'll live long enough to regret it." Cesare looked at him, and for the first time something shifted in his eyes. Not fear, something closer to understanding that a quick death would be kinder than whatever Nico Ferraro had just promised without saying it outright. 2 of Nico's men came in, bound Cesare, and led him away. He didn't resist. He knew the rules of this world. He had helped write some of them, and now those rules had come back for him. Nico stood alone in Cesare's office, closed his eyes, and let out one long breath. Then he heard the scream. From the basement, echoing upward through the concrete floor, through the stairwell, cutting through the rain outside. Renata's voice. Matthias. Matthias is here. I hear my son. My son is here. Nico ran. Down the stairs, past the basement room where Elara had been held, down a deeper hallway he hadn't yet searched. Renata stood in front of a steel door at the far end, her hand pounding against the metal, shouting in a rush of Italian and English. Kira had freed her upstairs, and she had found her own way down here, guided by instinct, by the thing she always called a mother knows. The steel door was thick, locked with a keypad, heavy. Kira ran in with her equipment and started breaking the lock. 30 seconds. 40. 1 minute. Then a beep. The lock released. Kira pulled the door open, metal grinding against concrete. And the door swung wide. Inside was a small cell, a narrow bed against the wall, old books stacked on the floor and on the bedside table, hundreds of them, as if someone had read them so many times their spines had begun to fall apart. One weak overhead bulb, and in the farthest corner, drawn in on himself with his back pressed to the wall, was a thin man with a long beard, tangled hair, and eyes narrowed against the sudden flood of light from the hallway after too many years in darkness. Renata stepped inside first. She didn't run. She walked, one slow step at a time, as if she were afraid that if she moved too fast, the image would disappear the way 8 years of muttered truth had vanished, whenever no one believed her. She knelt in front of the man, lifted his gaunt face in both hands, looked into his eyes, and cried. Not loudly. Tears slipped down her lined cheeks, fell onto her hands, fell onto her son's hands, and she couldn't say anything except one word, over and over again. My boy, my boy, my boy. Nico stood in the doorway. His feet wouldn't move. The body that had carried him through bullets, and rain, and darkness. The body that had taken down Troy Hadden and faced Cesare Mancini without trembling. That body now stood frozen at the threshold, because the thin man in the cell was looking up, panic still in his face, but slowly giving way to recognition, to understanding. And those eyes, those gray eyes exactly like Nico's own, the eyes Nico had searched for over 8 years in every face on every street, those eyes looked at him and said, Nico? Nico broke. He dropped to his knees on the dirty concrete floor and pulled his brother into his arms, held him so tightly Matthias made a small sound of pain, but Nico still didn't let go. And Nico Ferraro, the most dangerous Mafia boss in Portland, the man his own people had never seen show anything but coldness and anger, cried like a child in that filthy basement under the dim yellow light while the rain hammered the roof overhead. Elara stood behind them in the hallway with her back against the cold concrete wall. Tears ran down her face, across the bruises Troy had left, across the dried blood, and she didn't wipe them away. She stood there and witnessed the moment. 8 years of pain, 8 years of searching, 8 years of Renata whispering the truth no one believed, had all been leading toward a brother finding his brother again, a mother holding her son again. And Kira Volkov stood beside Elara, turned her face away, wiped at her eyes quickly with the back of her hand, then turned back with her usual cold expression in place. But Elara had seen it in time. 1 week after the rainy night at the farm, the Ferraro house began to breathe again. Matthias was brought back to his old room on the 2nd floor, the room Renata had kept untouched for 8 years, never changing the sheets, never clearing away the books, never moving a single thing, as if she had always known the day would come when her son returned. Matthias was so thin his shoulder bones pressed sharply against his shirt. He flinched at every loud sound. He wasn't used to natural light after 8 years beneath artificial bulbs, so Renata drew the curtains only partway and opened them little by little each day. A little more, then a little more, patient as someone taming a creature that had been kept in a cage too long. She didn't leave Matthias's side for even half a step. She slept in the armchair beside his bed. She carried his meals upstairs because Matthias still wouldn't come down to the kitchen. Not yet. Too many people. Too much open space. She talked to him all day long, never needing him to answer, only needing him to hear his mother's voice and know that she was here, real, not a dream, not a hallucination in a concrete basement. And slowly, Matthias began to speak. Short sentences at first, broken ones. But each day there were more than the day before. The house began to hold real laughter again. Not loud laughter, not easy laughter, the smaller kind, the startled, precious kind. The kind that slips out when Renata scolds the porcelain statue in front of Matthias, and Matthias frowns and asks, "Mama, who are you yelling at?" And Renata says, "It's been looking at me with judgment in its eyes for 20 years, and I've had enough." Matthias looked at the statue, looked at his mother, and laughed. Small, soft, fragile, but laughter all the same. And Nico stood in the hallway outside, heard it, stopped, closed his eyes, leaned his head against the wall, and let out a breath as if something impossibly heavy had finally been lifted from his chest. Elara saw all of it. She watched this family fitting itself back together piece by piece, slowly, painfully, but truly fitting back together. And she was happy for them, truly happy. But something in her chest ached every time she saw Renata holding Matthias, every time she heard Nico say his brother's name in that softened voice he used for no one else. Something she didn't want to name, though she knew exactly what it was. On the 8th day after Matthias came home, Elara cleaned her room. Not cleaning to leave. Cleaning because she needed order. She folded her clothes, stacked the books Renata had lent her, wiped down the desk, swept the floor, and at the bottom of the closet, she found it. The torn little bag she had carried the night she climbed into Nico's trunk. She hadn't touched it since Dario had tucked it away for her in the closet on that first day. The bag was almost empty. An empty water bottle, a torn jacket, and in a small inner pocket, a photograph. Elara pulled it out. Small enough to fit in her palm, wrinkled, curled at the corners, faded with age. 2 children in the picture. A little girl about 8 years old, auburn hair, blue eyes, grinning wide, missing one front tooth. Beside her, a girl of about 5, blonde hair, brown eyes, smiling exactly the same way, one hand gripping her sister's tightly. Behind them stood the hallway of street, Agnes Orphanage, walls painted a washed-out blue, fluorescent lights overhead, Elara and Bryn, the only picture she had, taken by a volunteer one Christmas, printed on thin paper, and Elara had kept it for 20 years. Through every orphanage, through every temporary shelter, through 2 years in Coffee Creek, where she had hidden it inside the cover of a free Bible. Through the long months on the streets of Portland, this photograph was the last thing she had kept hold of when everything else was gone. Elara sat down on the floor with her back against the closet and looked at the picture, and cried. Not because she was angry at Bryn. She had been angry long enough. Angry in prison, angry on the streets. Angry every night she lay beneath a bridge, asking herself why her sister had left. She had been angry until there was nothing left of it. Now she cried because she remembered. She remembered that tiny hand holding hers every night in the dormitory at St. Agnes. She remembered Bryn's 5-year-old voice whispering, "Elara, tell me a story." She remembered the way Bryn, at 10 years old, had drawn a picture of the 2 of them and written beneath it in messy child's handwriting, "Elara and Bryn forever." She cried because she loved the little sister who had once been everything, the only reason she had endured so much, the person she had willingly gone to prison for. And she cried because she was accepting the truth, accepting that Bryn had chosen. Bryn had chosen to leave her. Not because Bryn was cruel. Maybe because Bryn was afraid. Maybe because Bryn was ashamed. Maybe because Bryn wasn't strong enough to face the sister who had given up everything for her. The reason didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Bryn had chosen, and Elara needed to stop waiting. She looked at the photograph one last time. 2 little girls grinning wide, hands clasped tight, standing in front of that faded blue hallway. Then she folded the picture, carefully, gently, and placed it in the drawer of the bedside table. She didn't throw it away. She wasn't throwing Bryn away. But she wasn't carrying it with her anymore either. She stood up, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, drew in one long breath, and stepped outside. In the garden, Renata was leading Matthias between the flower beds, pointing to each blossom, saying the name in Italian, then in English, then in Italian again, because for Renata once was never enough. Matthias walked slowly, his shoulders still tense, but he was outside. He was listening to his mother talk. He was alive. Dario stood beside the black SUV, polishing the glass with one hand, his right arm still slung in bandages, stubborn and unreasonable as ever. Nico stood in the first-floor hallway, one shoulder against a column, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching her come down the stairs. He looked at her eyes, saw the traces of tears not yet dry, and asked softly, "Are you all right?" Elara looked at him, looked at the garden, looked at Renata and Matthias among the flowers, looked at Dario polishing the car, looked at this house, the place she had entered barefoot with a torn bag, the place where she had first been locked in, then allowed to stay, then somehow come to belong. "I'm all right," she said, and this time, she meant it. That afternoon, Nico found Elara in the garden. She was sitting on the stone bench beside the rosebed Renata tended every morning, her eyes fixed somewhere far away, her hands resting on her knees, quiet in the way of someone who had just let go of something heavy. Nico sat down beside her. He didn't speak right away. He reached into the pocket of his jacket, took out a small silver key, plain and simple, set it in his palm, and held it out toward her. Elara looked at the key. "What key is that?" "The front gate. You're free. If you want to leave, you can leave." Elara looked at him, searching his unwavering stare for some sign of a joke, or a test, or a trap. There was none, only seriousness, and something softer beneath it that he was trying to hide and failing to hide at all. "Are you sending me away?" "I'm giving you your freedom," Nico said, his voice slow, weighing each word as if he had practiced this sentence many times and still wasn't used to saying it. "You deserve to stay here because you want to, not because you have nowhere else to go, not because Troy is out there, not because you know my secrets. You deserve a real choice." Elara took the key. It was small, light, cold in her hand. The smallest thing anyone had ever given her, and somehow the biggest, because it wasn't a key to the gate, it was a key to the cage. "And if I choose to stay?" she asked softly. "Then you stay. For your mother? No. For Matthias? No. For what then?" Silence. Wind moved through the garden, stirring Renata's roses, carrying the scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass. Nico looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't hide, didn't cover, didn't control his expression. He let Elara see everything in his eyes, everything he had held back for weeks, and he said it. "Because I love you." Elara forgot how to breathe. "I loved you from the moment you were lying in the trunk of my car, filthy, trembling, barefoot, with nothing but an empty bottle of water and a torn coat, looking at me with those blue eyes, and lying straight to my face, telling me you hadn't heard a thing. A terrible lie, but a brave one." He paused. "And I loved you every day after that. When you sat with my mother and listened to what no one else would hear, when you brought that notebook into my room and gave me the thing I hadn't been able to find in 8 years, when you hit Troy with your elbow and looked him in the face and said, 'You have no right over me,' when you sat in the dark kitchen and told me about Bryn without crying, even though I knew you wanted to. Nico Ferraro, the most dangerous mafia boss on the West Coast, the man his own people feared too much to look in the eye, was sitting on a stone bench in his mother's garden telling an orphan girl that he loved her, and his voice shook on the last word. "That's the worst confession I've ever heard," Elara said. "I'm a mafia boss, not a poet. That part is painfully obvious. But you're smiling. You're smiling with tears in your eyes." Then she leaned toward him, lifted her hand to his face, her fingers brushing the hard line of his jaw she had grown used to studying from a distance, and she kissed him. Not the kiss of a girl rescued by her hero, not the kiss of the weak kissing the powerful. This was the kiss of someone who had chosen. Elara Sinclair, 27 years old, orphan, former prisoner, once homeless, once beaten, once abandoned, once curled inside a car trunk, too frightened to breathe, chose to kiss Nico Ferraro because she wanted to, because she loved him, because for the first time in her life, she got to choose. 3 months later, Elara enrolled at Portland Community College, majoring in counseling psychology, with the goal of helping abused women and former inmates rebuild their lives. Renata made a phone call to the school the day Elara submitted her application. No one knew what she said, but Elara received an acceptance email within 48 hours and a scholarship she didn't remember applying for. When she asked Renata about it, Renata said calmly, "I'm old, dear. I don't remember calling anyone." Matthias gave Elara a book on the day her admission letter arrived. It was the first book he had read when he began to recover. The cover worn, the spine coming apart, and inside the front cover, in handwriting that still trembled as he relearned how to hold a pen, he had written, "For the one who listened when no one else would." Elara held the book and didn't cry. She had cried enough. Now she smiled. On the morning of Elara's first day of classes, she stood at the window of her room and looked down. Renata was in the garden, scolding the roses for blooming out of season, even though they were blooming exactly when they should, and Renata knew that perfectly well, but she needed to scold something every morning in order to feel alive. Matthias sat on the stone bench reading in the sun, his shoulders no longer drawn tight, his eyes no longer narrowed, the color beginning to return to his skin, and every now and then he looked up at his mother lecturing the flowers and smiled. Dario was polishing the black SUV with one hand, his right arm out of the sling now but still weak, and he remained stubbornly committed to polishing that car every morning because it was what he had done for 40 years, and no bullet was going to change that. And Nico stood in the courtyard beside the car, waiting to drive her to class. He looked up toward the window, saw her standing there, and smiled. The smile Elara knew belonged only to her. 6 months earlier, she had been curled inside the trunk of that same SUV, barefoot, bruised, with nothing in the world except an empty bottle of water and a wrinkled photograph of 2 little girls in an orphanage hallway. She had run from one devil and fallen straight into the hands of another. But that devil fed her when she was hungry, gave her a room when she had no home, gave her a family when she had no one left, and in the end, gave her the key to the front gate and said, "You're free. If you want to go, go." Elara Sinclair wasn't rescued. She saved herself. She climbed into that trunk by instinct, by the stubborn will to survive. She listened to Renata with patience. She pieced together clues with intelligence. She faced Troy with courage. She let go of Bryn with inner strength. No one saved her. She only needed someone to open the door, and Nico Ferraro opened it. Elara's story reminds us that no one is born to be abandoned forever, that sometimes light begins in the darkest place, that listening to someone dismissed as crazy can save an entire family, that letting go doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to keep living, and that you don't need to be saved. You only need the courage to walk into the dark and trust that you'll find your way out. If this story touched your heart, please hit like to support us in bringing you more meaningful stories. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear that their life isn't over, that the most beautiful chapter may still be waiting ahead. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now so you don't miss the new stories we share every day. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel. Which part moved you the most? Have you ever lived through a moment like Elara's, when you were abandoned but still chose to believe in life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every line, and we always want to listen to the stories that come from the deepest places in your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Thank you for being here with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.